You're watching HFO-TV.
Welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner here at HFO Investment Real Estate. Today we have Peggy Moretti, Executive Director of the Historic Preservation League of Oregon, to talk a little bit about historic preservation of apartment buildings. Thank you for coming.
It's nice to be here.
Thank you. Can you tell me a little something about the mission and history of the Preservation League of Oregon?
Sure. Well, we're a nonprofit. We've been around since 1977, so we're into our 36th year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And we're a statewide organization. We're headquartered here in Portland, and our mission is really to preserve and reuse and pass forward Oregon's historic places. And so we're really very interested in rehabilitation and adaptive reuse of historic buildings and promoting them as wonderful assets both culturally and economically.
In all types of buildings, regarding use, apartments?
Apartments would be one of them,
Okay.
sure.
Okay.
But homes, neighborhoods, commercial, residential, rural and urban, bridges, barns.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
so really any structure.
We have a very rich state in cultural assets, so we're
Oh,
fortunate.
nice. So what makes a building, or specifically an apartment building, historic?
Well, any building or apartment building is considered historic if, and I put that in quotes, if it's 50 years old. So
Okay.
there's kind of an age qualification there. And it tends to also have a need for some sort of significance, either architecturally or historically or some event that would happen. And but sort of age and significance would be two things.
Okay, so as we're getting older, 1970s buildings could actually go historic?
Eventually, they
Eventually
could.
those
Certainly, the 60s are now. In fact, the mid-century modern I mean, it's a very hot trend right now. So it doesn't have to be from the 1890s. It could be from the 1950s or 60s and still be considered historic.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So there are property owners who, in addition to managing their investments, really care about historic integrity of their property. What advice or help does your organization do for that? I mean, what are the kind of the steps that you can help us with?
Well, I think now I wish we had a magic database that had all the information on all the buildings in Oregon, and we don't.
We all do. We all wish we had that.
Yeah, I know. We can point people towards really good resources, though, whether on the governmental side or even on the more academic, historic research side.
Okay.
We always encourage folks to learn about the history of their building. I would suggest that if it's not really clear or hasn't already been documented, that they find out who the architect was and a little bit about its history, its age, and the context of the neighborhood in which it sits. Because in many cases, if they might be actually eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. So that's something I think an owner of an older building might want to understand.
Right.
Because listing on the National Register then opens the door to potential rehabilitation tax credits and other benefits down the road.
Okay. So
like the special assessment program here in Oregon, which is the property tax value freeze.
right, where you'll freeze it if you're in the historic registry. But there's
Yes.
some limitations about once you're on that of what you can and can't do to the property.
Yes, if you are receiving tax credits of one sort or another, then any rehabilitation work you do has to adhere to certain standards that are set out by the Secretary of the Interior, and but they're pretty common sense. They boil down to don't destroy the historic character of the building, and so within those standards, so there is actually quite a bit of latitude.
And is that on the interior and exterior? Because I know I've had a lot of owners that have said to me, well, I have a historic building, I know I can't do anything to the exterior, but on the interior
There's a lot more latitude on the interior.
Okay.
Yes, I think as a rule, I'm going to speak in generalizations
I know,
here.
exactly.
It's the exterior envelope of a building that matters, and particularly the public view of the building, not as maybe the hidden back courtyard.
As we kind of say, the back of house is kind of more okay.
Yeah,
The front of the house.
It's a little, less concerning. Mm-hmm.
And do you have an inventory? I know we love to have all the history on these. Do you have an inventory of how many of these properties potentially are in there? Or
Well, we have an inventory in the state that is out of date. What's missing on the historic inventory in Portland and in Oregon are more the later mid-century resources. The last comprehensive inventory that was taken was in the 80s. And there have been some partial inventories going on, but it's still not comprehensive. So, I always had, I come out of a business background, and we always used to say you cannot manage what you cannot measure.
Yes.
And so it would be wonderful if we could get that inventory updated. But there are nonetheless, there's a likelihood that there's been some inventory of a building in the past.
Okay. And is it imperative on the owner to see if they would qualify, or how does that step happen? If I've got a building that's built in 1963, and I think, hey, this may be historic, do I contact the Preservation League to say, hey, what do you think? Or
you're welcome to call us.
Okay.
You are, and there's also a state agency that manages the National Register in Oregon, and eventually there's documents and criteria that you can explore. But it really is, it's a completely voluntary thing, so yes, it's up to the owner. Nobody's going to make you do it.
Right.
Yeah.
So in this state, how many buildings get designated National Historic?
On the National Register, I can't segment out apartments, but we have, I believe, about 17,000 buildings in Oregon.
Wow.
On the National Register, either individually listed or as within historic districts, like in Northwest Portland, there's the Alphabet District.
Right.
That's a district. So if you have a historic property inside that district, you are on the register.
You're already in that group. And
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now, I know one thing on speaking of Northwest, is the unreinforced masonry buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Again, they're old, historic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do we have a catalog on those, or kind of what's the plan with those moving forward?
Well, we know that across the state there are about at least 5,000 unreinforced masonry buildings, URMs, that probably date between the late 1800s and the early 1900s.
Okay.
Generally, there was some reinforcement in the construction that once you got into the 20s and 30s, so it was kind of, there's some level of, doesn't mean you're seismically sound, but probably not technically considered a URM. In Portland, we are again in the process of doing some inventorying on that. The city is starting to do more of that, but we estimate there are at least 200 URM apartment buildings in
Right.
Portland, and that's about 5,200 units. And we estimate there's another 100 or so that are partially unreinforced masonry buildings. So it's a significant inventory here in just Portland.
And now, as if we have an unreinforced masonry, what needs, with the seismic upgrades, how does that affect being historic? Is there things that could get done that may...
Well, there's nothing that will trigger at this moment. There's
Right.
nothing that triggers a mandatory seismic upgrade unless you are changing the use of a building or investing a certain amount in its rehab. And if you ask me what those triggers are in detail, I'm
it's
going to
fine.
blank out on that. But a lot of work that's being done now is either triggered by a major initiative or the adaptive reuse of, say, a warehouse into apartments, or it's voluntary. One of our board members owns several URM apartments in Portland, and he has been voluntarily working on them to implement some upgrades.
So is there a battle with trying to implement seismic upgrades, and they're trying to keep the historic preservation of the property? Or the seismic upgrades where you can do enough that we're kind of, like you said, back of the house?
No, yeah, the good news is there are a number of new techniques and options that are being developed all the time that will create seismic upgrades, and there are levels of seismic.
Right.
One of the things, I'm not a technical person, I'm not an architect, and I'm not a developer, so a lot of this has been new to me. But as we did this initiative last year called the Preservation Roundtable, and our topic was URMs in historic buildings. And as I learned more about it going through this process, and we talked not only in Portland but in other communities around the state, property owners, when you start talking seismic, their eyes just kind of roll back in their heads. They go, "Oh, I don't want to think about that. It's just too big, too expensive, and you just kind of want to run away from it." But so one of the things that people, I think, are not aware of is that there are levels of seismic upgrades, and it could be approached in phases. And
Right.
there are some basic things you can do that would have a profound effect in terms of basic safety in an earthquake that do not require you dismantling and reassembling the building. So some of the simple phase one things would involve making sure if you've got a parapet on the top of your building that it's anchored down, that the roof and the floors are anchored into the walls, and you create that much more stable structural situation, so that goes a long way towards the seismic upgrades. Other times people sink seismic into the elevator shaft or the stairwells or things like that you can strengthen the envelope of a building without
So you can do little
completely
parts and
obliterating
pieces.
its historic
Right.
character. Yeah.
So is the goal of the Historic Preservation League is to find these historic buildings and make sure they're preserved, and helping the owners, either with tax credits or just education as to, hey, you have a historic building, let's think about it before you decide to rip off all the awnings and paint it a different color and change the windows.
Yeah, we're all about trying to convey knowledge,
Right.
and awareness and knowledge and appreciation of these as assets beyond just the dollars and cents,
Right.
which of course is important. We also advocate for good policy, and what we're trying to work on is to identify solutions that might need to be pushed for and advocated for by organizations like ours, and working with other leaders in the city to say, hey, you know what, we need to take a look at incentives. We need better incentives for seismic upgrade, or we need more flexibility in code and policy, so that folks can phase these things in and make it more affordable, because we're very aware of the economic challenges of tackling this along with other rehab, probably.
And do you look at specific neighborhoods and say, we want to target this neighborhood as similar to the Alphabet District in Northwest? Hey, this is a historic neighborhood. We want to, what's the process of doing that?
We like to, I would say we prioritize the historic districts, the ones that are designated as officially historic districts, but we are very happy to talk with anybody, and we don't always have every answer, and sometimes we're going to be able to point them to a resource, or offer some advice, and sometimes just finding the right expertise goes a long ways to identifying a solution. So.
Okay, well, I'm interested to see when we hit 2020, when we see which buildings that were built in the 70s will go as historic.
I'm sorry, that's not my favorite decade from a design and architecture standpoint. I don't know, but
yes.
But I know there's some gems in there.
Yeah, we are seeing a revitalization of the 1960s that we've seen it even in multifamily. I mean, where they're going in and keeping that look on the outside, on the inside just kind of updating it, seeing if they can put washer and dryers in, maybe redo some of the finishes, but keep that feel. And
it's taking people a while to think of modern as historic.
Yes.
And let's face it, buildings go through these phases of being what we call remodeled, that where they've been messed around with, and you almost need to undo some of that and go back to that original design that maybe fell out of favor, and now it's back in style.
Definitely.
And it was true with Victorian, it was true with arts and crafts, now it's true with modern.
Yes. Well, thank you again for coming. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And you can see on the website here where to get more information on the Historic Preservation League of Oregon.
Yeah, and they're welcome to download our special report on the URMs, and you can get that on our website under the tab for the Preservation Roundtable.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you again for coming to HFO-TV. Great. That was nice.
Okay?
Very good. Yeah. Perfect.
Thanks for watching HFO TV. To learn more about HFO, call or visit our website. See new listings, apartment news, videos, and more when you download our apps at the Android and iPhone markets.